Yes, all right. I think we are actually live now. And we're back. Yes. Cool. Let us know in the chat if you can hear us. Um, as you can see, we've got a fancier setup this time around. Oh my gosh, this stream as live as every indie MMORPG. Now it's far more live than any MMORPG that's created by an indie. Cool. So thanks, guys, for your patience there. It wouldn't be a live stream if you didn't have some sort of technical difficulties. But hopefully we'll have a good one. I hope you guys brought some code and some questions. We're going to try to do some code review today. Obviously, let us know if the audio settings are good. Yes, you can hear us. Great. For those of you joining the stream or watching this VOD later on, my name is Charles. I'm here with Jason. We're both game developers. He's actually a professional game developer. He does some contracting. And I am a professional software developer who just likes to do game development tutorials, specifically in Unity. So, yeah, this is our weekly live stream. We are trying to do this weekly. This is the second one. And the last one was great. We got a lot of cool clips out of that, and had a lot of good questions. So Jason's cam has been updated to HD rather than the 1990s quality of the last stream. Heck yeah, man! After that last one, we had to up our game. Can you talk, Jason? I want to make sure.
Yeah, I can, and it's even the same wall. It just happened to have stuff on it now instead of just being a dark, dank corner of my room.
That's like one of the great things about streaming or doing videos is that it's like it forces you to clean up and make your office look presentable.
And of course, the obligatory neon lights I'm going to have to buy to catch up with you, Charles.
Of course. Everyone always like would mess with me for my RGB, but I love it. It looks great, right? And I got a remote so I can change the colors. Got some purple,
Ooh, fancy.
red. If we start talking about MMOs and we get a rant going, I'll switch it to red. And of course, we've got Chip here. It's my cat. Hopefully, he'll hang around with us. All right, so look at that. What's that game in the background? Clean Code. Never heard of it. It's a great game. Not a lot of people play it.
No, it's not as not as popular as it probably should be.
So if anyone brought some code or to review or some questions, feel free to drop them. Drop them in the chat. I'm trying out my chat bot today, so you might see some automated messages come through. Yeah, so MMOs. What's your favorite indie MMO? If you can answer that in the chat today, you get a special prize from Jason. Oh, I lost you there, Jason. I lost your audio.
Oh, typical.
Oh, there it is. You're back. I don't know what happened there.
That's officially become my favorite question. What's your favorite indie MMO?
One day, there's going to be an indie MMO that comes out.
And I'm going to have to change my question.
It's going to be, what's your favorite indie MMO that isn't insert the title of that MMO? See, all hail Chip. Thank you. All hail Chip. You're a celebrity, buddy.
So actually, I have an interesting point to bring up. I hit across an interesting bug today that I've never seen before. So in the interest of code clarity, I set up a project that was as per my usual, I make external DLLs, and I did a HTTP. It was just basically contacting an API, doing some web calls, and I used the web client. Now, fun fact: if you don't use the Unity, the async, the Unity web request, the version that they want to use, the kind of the native Unity version of handling REST API calls, if you don't use that and you use the actual sort of the .NET standard variants, that works fine in mono. It doesn't work fine if you're building to mobile devices.
Interesting.
I ended up hitting this bug where the calls were not coming back with the correct response codes, and it was exclusively because I wasn't using the Unity web request that I probably should have been using. So that was a fun exercise that took me a few hours to figure out.
That was the best. So if you guys want to share some code, I realized I didn't mention how you could do that.
I'd recommend Pastebin. Yeah, Pastebin is sufficiently good that I got a pro account years ago, and it's never steered me wrong. Nice. It's really handy to be able to just throw people snippets of code from different languages.
Yeah. What's the way the best way to transition from full-time software developer to an indie game developer. We actually got a similar question on the last stream, which was how do you break into the game development industry? And I think it's in the same spirit.
Mm.
Basically, what, in a nutshell, you want to position yourself by networking, whether it be on a forum or Discord, or in real life by going to conventions, events, and like meetups. And it's just one of those things where there's no one path to get there, but just by being consistent, talking to people, genuinely forming relationships with people who are in the industry, that's the best way to position yourself to land a job when it becomes available.
The other thing I'd say as well is to do it slowly. I mean, it's not a very fun thing to say, but the unfortunate truth is you should treat it as a hobby until it's a job. And that's kind of the way it's always worked from everyone I've talked to. There's the kind of the fun advice of jump in, quit your job and go full time. And it's, to be honest, that's just not very practical. Your best bet is to start producing a portfolio of work. And hopefully over time, meeting the right people and showing them your work, you'll eventually get offered something that's better than the job you had. Like in my case, it was a case of somebody saying, I have a job for you that's 2 years worth of your current salary for 6 months work, but I'll need you full time. And that was me sort of, I had my choice. I can either dive into this full time or I can keep doing what I'm doing. And you can't just start like that. You have to get to the point where enough people know you and trust your work that they're going to give you those kinds of offers. So the best way, join communities, make work, show people stuff, and stick with your main job until you have enough clout to move on to it.
Yeah, and the question was how do you transition? So it does sound like you do have a job, and that's great, and you definitely want to hold on to that. And it might even mean doing some things, helping people out with current projects and contributing. That's a nice light way to ease your way into it. Don't turn down the opportunity to look at someone's code and. So yeah. Oh, we got a super chat in and out. Can either of you guys explain the programming concept known as reflection? Ooh, what is it? Can it be applied to game code in Unity?
Can it or should it?
Yeah, it's like that meme, that Jurassic Park meme where Ian Malcolm's like, no one asked if we should do it. They were too preoccupied with if we could. No one asked if we should. Yeah.
Do you want to take this one or will I?
I think that you'll have a more technical answer. But from what I understand, and I've used reflection, but I've never really dived in. I understand it's very expensive to use reflection, and so if you're using, it's game development, so you want to optimize as much as possible, and that's my kind of high level answer. Mm-hmm. It's not very optimal, so people don't typically use it, but I think Jason's going to get into the weeds.
It's literally runtime compiling. So I mean, we take it for granted that a compiler now happens so fast you can just basically press a button and build your project. But if you ever listen to a talk by anybody who's been programming for 20 years or more, what they're going to tell you is compiling used to take, hours. Maybe even when it got good, it was still 25, 30 minutes depending on what you're compiling. So we take for granted how much work is involved in literally building your code and compiling it into DLLs and that kind of thing. And if you're doing reflection, you're effectively reading your code and then, well, reflection initially is just reading it, but then you're probably going to be running code once you read it, right? You're going to compile it into something, or you're going to generate things from the code. So usually I do not recommend it in any game scenario whatsoever. It's useful for two cases, though. It's useful for anything that's event-driven, not loop-driven. So games are loop-driven because you're basically doing stuff per frame. But if you're doing something where you've built an app in Unity that's not dependent on a game loop, so turn-based or something, you could technically get away with it. You still shouldn't do it, but you could get away with it. But the best case for an actual practical application inside of a game would be tool development. So I actually do use a bit of reflection on a number of my projects, because what I do is I read the folder structure and the files I have, and I generate consts for the actual instances and entities I've got. So instead of writing a giant list of enums, which, by the way, don't use enums for things that aren't a closed list. So use enums for days of the week. There's only ever going to be the amount there are. If that changes, you've got a bigger problem than your software. Don't use them for things like number of weapon types, because that will change over the course of your application, and it's not what it's for. So what I do is I just make a public class and I use static fields. And the static field, I just add one for each different entity type I have. The reason why, it's only a compile time safety on a string, and the string can be used dynamically. It gives you a lot more freedom. You can do generators, all sorts of fun stuff. Long story short, you don't have to write those in manually. It gets a bit tedious if you're writing public static read-only string or public const string, whatever it is, for each and every type of weapon or gun or level or scene or whatever. You can use reflection to basically say, read this folder, get the different instances, and then build that file for you. So you can use reflection in editor to do things that would otherwise require you to write repetitious or similar code. And that's a very good case for it, because when you start getting into things like multiple types of the same entities or variations of things, if it's not prefab based but code based, you can actually do some really good data manipulation there and have it automatically save you a lot of time. So
Yeah. Yeah, you brought up two good points. One thing that I hear, I actually see this a lot, in my day job. This actually came up like 2 weeks ago. One of the developers added a new enum to the application. And I was like, listen, this shouldn't be an enum. And he was just like, but why? I don't understand. It's like, it's a subset of options, and it seems like it makes sense to me. And I was like, yeah, but it's not an exhausted list. Like, you have not exhausted all the possible options. And you said days of the week. That's a great example. There are a finite number of options for days of the week. So that can be an enum because it will never change. And I think, and even personally myself, I hate to say I abused enums, but it's like, it's kind of like it's there. It seems like it makes sense for like weapon types or something like that. But yeah, when you're going to use an enum, when you're considering using an enum, you should ask the question: have I exhausted every possible option that could be in this enum? Another thing that you brought up was the tooling. Yeah, and that's something that a lot of game developers, it's something that I would like to get across more on my channel and make more videos about and talk about, is the aspect of game development that is, tooling, supporting your project with proprietary tools. And whatever, I can go on a rant on that. But
well, that's, to be honest, one of my favorite parts of software in general. I mean, it is really fun having stuff move around on screen, but there's something really cool about making custom inspectors and having code generators, and like, it's a really silly thing, but whenever I have an interface for an object, so a common thing I do is I have a concept called an actor. And an actor is just when I encapsulate a single object in my scene and I say, this object can turn on or off, show or hide, and probably has some basic action. So a good example of this would be a light or some prop in the scene that has sort of a finite set of things it does, but it's sort of just an actor in the scene. It's meant to sort of add ambience or whatever. I build an inspector for that gives me the buttons in the inspector for on, off, show, and hide. And then what I also do is I build an actor manager, which will group them all and then let me toggle them off based on rooms or based on categories they're in. I don't need to do this, but it means that the designers in the team can copy the actor script, put it onto any other object, hook up animations to the shows and hides. It automatically gets added to the manager class, and I can control it from one place, or they can control it from one place. And so it gives you this really nice set of, I don't know, just automated tooling that makes everything easier to work with, and you don't think about it again. So tool development is one of my favorite. The other thing, reading files, like the amount of times I think about level design when it's procedural, and at the end of the day, you're just looping and then adding things based on some algorithm. You can load that stuff in from files. So it's so easy to just take a 2D array in a text file, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, and just basically build a structure for what your layout is. Load it in. It's completely, it has no data associated with it other than positional data. And you can take that map layout and then feed in a block category or a entity type list and just say, for each 0, this thing, for each 1, this thing, for each 2, this thing. And you can basically load all of that in with automated tooling. And then you can even build an external editor which can generate those by, type in a number of width by height and then draw a grid. And then you can have it like read a text of sprites and then give the editor something fun to play with outside of Unity that would build these text files. There's so many amazing things you can do that, like, it's really can't be said enough. A lot of people think game development is literally writing the code that appears on screen or the stuff that makes things move. But there's an entire industry of people whose sole job it is to make the production faster, to add more assets to the game world, to extend the various different components of the world. Another one is localization. Like, that's so hard to do. To have a tool that will automate all of the different languages and replace the text where it needs to be. like if you can do this, you can save yourself what would be somebody's job for about a month just trying to get all of the right text in all of the right places. So it isn't something to scoff at, you know. It's actually very fun to do.
Yeah, and if you consider games like massive games like Red Dead Redemption is the one I always use. Um, Imagine if they had to touch the code every time they wanted to add a new quest. Like if you think about it like that and you sort of reverse engineer it in that way, I mean, the tooling that's in that game must be out of this world. And obviously they probably reuse the same engine that they used to create Grand Theft Auto and all those other open world games. But that's basically what someone's, probably a whole department's job is at Rockstar, is to create tools so that, you know, it does become a little more turnkey. Now when they want to make the next, open world game, they want to set it in a completely different story or timeline or whatever, they can do it because it's just sort of a matter of you have these people who are now experts inside of Rockstar using those tools. They're power users of those internal tools, and they can probably crank out a game much faster than the first go around when they were creating, Grand Theft Auto 5 or the other open world games. So cool, yeah, tooling. I love it. I'm a huge advocate for tooling. All right, let's see what kind of questions we got here. I saw this one come up twice, so I'll read it. Do you guys know about any Unity VR tutorials? I've basically just started Unity's
I
2D.
have
Yeah.
one straight away. It's really fun on that. Unity literally just released one, like right down to I
No
think it
kidding.
was, yeah, about last week or something. So if you follow their blog, they produce a lot of learning material. And I've said this before, Unity up to now have not really been dogfooding their own stuff. They've just not been. It never felt like they were making games in their own engine, and that always
Explain
felt a
to
little
us
bit.
what that means, that term, because I don't think a lot of
Okay,
people
yeah.
know.
So dog fooding, it's great. It basically means eating your own dog food. It's sort of it's shorthand for do you actually use the tools you develop yourself? And this is a very big, it's a red flag if you've got a company that produces, any kind of software and they're using a different bit of software internally to do the same thing. It means they have no faith in what they're doing. And I'm not saying Unity was doing that specifically, but what they were doing is it felt like they were trying to match the requirements they perceived developers having, not what developers were actively dealing with on a regular basis, because they weren't actually making their own content. And so, by the nature of them more recently building their own projects, their own videos, and even some game demos and stuff, it feels like they have a much better handle on what the things that actually hold you up are as a developer. And so, the more recent Unity stuff all feels like it's aimed to actually save time and solve problems that devs have. So with that in mind, one of the new courses they have is literally how to do an interactable escape room or something using a VR in Unity. And I
Hmm.
haven't used it myself, but I've watched the kind of trailer they did, and it looks solid. So
That's
I'd
cool.
give that a go. It's like directly from the horse's mouth, so to speak.
Yeah, and I would say that Unity, it would appear to me that they are doing a lot of dog fooding because you see, I forget what his name is. I think it's Matt Shell. You see them coming out with a lot of material, and it's probably been a bit more of a push in the last 2 years. But you see a lot of good stuff coming out, and maybe the tutorials, like they came out with a couple, like the first-person shooter that you look through that code and it's like, what is this? This is not helpful to me. But I'm sure in that process they probably came to a lot of conclusions about like the UNet or the multiplayer stuff and how some of those things were probably really difficult to put together. I mean, I know that with the other big demo that came out around the same time was the Massive City one that showed off Unity ECS. Forgot what it was called, but I was actually at Unite in 2018 when that keynote dropped, and then there was a whole bunch of sessions about that mega. It was called Mega City. There was a whole bunch of sessions about Mega City, and I went to every single one because at the time I was like really into covering ECS. And honestly, that for me was kind of like a catalyst that I was like, I think at this point I'm going to stop covering ECS because every single one of those talks, as they were pulling off the covers at different aspects of that megacity, I was like, wow, this is not ready. Everything they're describing sounds awful and hard to use. Impressive, and it was actually very functional and it was very optimized. I'm not taking away from that, but from from a developer's perspective, you could just see that they had not worked out the kinks at that time. Now I think they have, and I might start covering ECS probably towards the end of next year, or maybe towards the middle, depending. But yeah, it's you can tell now that Unity's really starting to use their software in a more realistic way, like we would use it, like indie developers would use it.
Yeah, because even a big part of that was the tooling. So we talked about developer tooling earlier. With the earlier ECS stuff, you had to use everything with external profiling and stuff. You couldn't see in editor what you were doing. But more recently, you can actually view the actual entities and what you're making and how they're interacting and stuff. And so the fact that you can even have a button which can convert things to ECS entities, it's like, okay, they're leaning on it actually in a way that's practical for people to use now, rather than it being like almost tacking another engine on top of Unity just to function to make the games, you know?
Yeah, definitely. And they had the whole hybrid ECS for a while, and it's good that they released it, and because it was a good opportunity for people to see what it was, but it really was alpha. So you got a lot of people getting really hyped about it, and then it's like, well, it's not even close to being ready. So, and then people like me who make an 8-part tutorial series that's completely deprecated now. That gets lots of views, and people are like, "Hey, this doesn't work anymore."
Yeah, it'll be endlessly chasing the dragon if you're trying to keep up with all of the changes. You'll be making videos every week, and they'll be completely unrelated to each other.
Oh, that's funny. Speaking of ECS, I just got a question about it that I could probably answer. Hey, question for you. I have an assignment where I have to work with ECS, and I have to instantiate missiles, but I don't understand ECS at all. So who's assigning you an assignment about ECS and hasn't taught you about it at all? I want to talk to that professor. But basically, in a nutshell, ECS stands for Entity Component System. It's an architectural design pattern where basically you define components. That's kind of like the crux of your code, is you define components that hold data, state data. So for instance, a component could be position, and that would hold X, Y, and Z. Or for like maybe you might make a player component that would hold some metadata about the player, like health. And then so you have those components, and each of these components work together to create an entity. So you have an entity that consists of multiple components. And then the systems, you create systems that their whole job is just to act on components. So you might have a system that's called the player health system, and it's going to only be interested in entities that have a component, the player component, for instance, and then it'll just track the health. And so all those pieces work together architecturally to basically, that's how you write your entire project. And that's kind of why I think some people hate it and some people love it, because when you do use ECS, it's like that's your whole project. Like it's so coupled. The design pattern is so coupled to how you architect the entire project that there's no like hybrid ECS. You can't really go do a half measure. It's like I feel like it's either in or out. Kind of like MVC. When you make an MVC application, like there's no middle ground. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Oh no, it's pretty much it. Like it's one of those. You make a good point. It's an architecture, right? It's like you're building a framework, and if you try to tack on different things at the side of it, you're going to break its fundamental design. So ECS by nature requires you to lean in hard on the idea, and quite frankly, I'm not ready yet. And most of the projects I've had to work on, like there's some features missing from ECS, like right down to now this version's a lot better, but before this you couldn't even use things like rigid body physics at all. Like you just couldn't use physics with ECS, and so there's a lot of things. I don't want to get to the point where I'm using ECS on a project and all of a sudden there's a feature I just took for granted would be available and it isn't, and it's like oh, and it's not like I can just tack it on not ECS. You have to lean in with the whole thing. So if there's a missing feature, there's a missing feature. So it's not quite as production ready even now. Like it's good for projects to learn, and I honestly do think ECS will be the way to go for games going forward. I've mentioned before, Overwatch is built using an entity model, and a lot more games than people think actually are. It's just not as advertised, but it will soon become, I think, the de facto way for a lot of projects. It's just I just don't want to, not until it's ready. So I'm just not going to lean in myself yet.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would say, maybe familiarize yourself with the pattern just so you can understand it, and then you can play around with it. But yeah, don't expect to be able to use it on any projects. In fact, when I was developing that ECS series, I got to a point where I realized that there was no animation aspect that was fleshed out yet, or implementation. And so I got to the end and I was like, oh gosh, this looks awful. Like I'm not going to be able to finish this tutorial series. And I think I literally just said at the end, like, well, I can't animate it, so
Yeah. So
I
good luck, I
use,
guess.
yeah. Oh, check it out. Got a super chat here. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate it. Let's see what the question is. Sometimes in the awake function of a singleton, a coder will check it if there are multiple instances of that object and delete them. Should I also do this for my player object, since there should only be one Mario in Super Mario World? Ooh, a question about singletons. You want to take that one, Jason? Kick us off.
Oh yeah, this is an interesting one. So I personally am not a fan of using that pattern specifically for anything that's not a manager.
Hmm.
So you're right technically that there should only be one player in your scene, but the interesting thing about how games work is you often have to cheat. So there's a lot of cases where you'll duplicate a player for the sake of some visual thing, or like there's a very good example in Half-Life 2, I think. No, it wasn't Half-Life. I forgot what game it was. There was some game where the game didn't have vehicles. So what they did is they made a character, stuck a vehicle on its head, and placed it under the ground. So it was literally a walking player with a vehicle for a head, because it was a rare case where they only needed this one odd instance. Now that's a silly one, but the point is, conceptually that's nothing you ever think about doing, but it works for a problem that they had. A player, to me, is an entity that's active in your scene, and so maybe you want some kind of manager class that would deal with that problem, and it only has one instance. But I personally don't like to tie that kind of state logic to a single object of any kind that conceivably could have more than one. There's a lot more to it than that in terms of when you're creating those kinds of managers. There's also state, and depending on how you manage your state, if you're not persisting it out of the scene, you can end up thinking you're deleting an object and cloning it, but the version you have in the second scene is technically slightly different. It like doesn't have a script you've added, like when they equip something, or there's a status effect in some object, and so when you go to the next scene, it picks not the one you think it will. It'll delete the one you don't want, and then keep the one whatever else, and you end up with really odd scenarios. So in short, I don't recommend that pattern for that kind of an object. I think you should have something that manages state and then instantiate a new player if you transition scenes, and then sort of try to duplicate state between them, and have some sort of state manager that may have a singleton awake, but not the actual actors themselves.
It's interesting too. Like what he just is describing is a use case of a singleton, or an implementation of a singleton that is specific to Unity, and it the implementation itself is doing stuff that I come from, like, what in my day job I work with an MVC framework called Grails, and it's all like 100% convention over configuration, meaning that if you follow the convention, then things will happen. A lot of magic happens behind the scenes. Like if you name something like visitor with a controller, if you put the word controller, then it's seen as a controller in the framework. And I don't like those implicit things that create magic, because I personally have a really bad memory, so I forget that sort of stuff all the time. And then on another note, some people just don't know. So there have been times where developers come on a project and they don't really understand Grails, and you're like, well, they're a competent developer, so they should be able to help out. And they do things that they just don't understand, and it's not their fault. It's just that that particular framework relies so heavily on the convention and doing all these implicit secret things. And I think things like having an awake function that deletes a game object out of the scene, like the singleton pattern, I just don't like that sort of implicit stuff, because someone who doesn't know might, like Jason said, try to drag another player in, just for a visual effect, and all of a sudden the other player gets deleted, and you're like, what the heck? What's going on here? And then all of a sudden that developer who doesn't understand is chasing down code, and even if it only takes them 15 minutes to track down the particular script, oh, I see here it's a singleton. I mean, that's 15 minutes lost that didn't need to get lost because he thought it was a bug, or she thought it was a bug, and it really wasn't a bug. It was a script acting as it was intended, but it was doing it in such a secretive and magical way that it's like he had to track it down and figure it out. And I just don't I don't like things like that personally.
Yeah, and the other thing too is depending on the complexity of your project, people get very stuck on this is a major problem that bothers the hell out of me is a lot of people they see an implementation of design pattern and they internalize those lines of code meaning that design pattern, but the pattern is what a problem it's solving. It's not the literal lines of code you're seeing it physically do. So a good example of this, a singleton that you're picturing is probably public static instance equals this, or instance equals new, whatever, if it's not a mono behavior. But if you're using a dependency injection framework, a singleton is just dot as single or as static or something to that effect,
Right.
because a singleton just means you gate the ability to have more than one instance. In fact, if you're doing a C# application, say WinForms, you can use something called the mutex, and it makes your application a singleton. It effectively means you cannot load more than one instance of it. And if you ever had a problem, if you've ever opened a project where you wanted to have two instances side by side and the application wouldn't let you and you got very annoyed, that's a very good reason why
like
you
Discord,
don't use singletons. Yeah, you want to let the client do that if that's going to be something that they actually need for what they're doing. So a singleton doesn't necessarily mean, public static instance. It means making sure this object can only happen once in the context of your code. Any method of getting this object will always return the same object. That is what a singleton is. The singleton instance pattern that you're used to seeing is just one implementation of it. So if the real question is, are singletons bad? No. Can that particular version bite you in the ass? Probably. If you use something like a dependency injection framework, you can actually toggle on the instancing nature of an object, and it's not as bad because you can control that at a contextual sort of configuration level. But if you're baking singleton-ness into an object, you are forever declaring this is one thing and one thing only. And it may make sense when you write it for the first time, going, it's an audio manager, it manages audio, I only need one thing of audio, I'm never going to change it. Well, down the line, you switch platforms to, you're using Fmod now or Wwise when you weren't before, and your previous audio manager was Master Audio, and you're thinking, oh, well, I'm just going to switch entirely. I'll make a new audio manager, and it uses the new system. Well, some of that stuff doesn't play well. Maybe you've got certain files that have to load through Unity because you're doing something with the mixer to do with your footsteps, and you don't have a way at the moment of hooking that up correctly through Fmod. Now, Fmod, yes, it can do all of that stuff, but say you're kind of doing a part and parcel, whatever. Long story short, you find yourself in a weird scenario that doesn't make sense where you've got two audio managers. Now, it might be temporary, but you didn't see that coming. So you have to be really damn sure when you're writing this is a singleton that it really is a singleton. And that's why the things that normally take on the role of singleton is something where if two things took that same job, the application would fundamentally break. So a scene manager or an application state manager usually fits for a good singleton, because it's not that you couldn't technically have two of them, but it's that if you did have two of them, your game would actually become unstable. It would fundamentally not work the way you expect it to with two of them in it. And if you ever find yourself needing two game managers, you've probably broken something in your code. If you're in a situation where you need to have two of the single game state running at once. Game instances, different, whatever. I don't get really specific on details, but the general point is a singleton literally is you declaring this can only be one of this thing, because if there is more than one, bad things will happen. So TLDR, singletons aren't bad, but they can so often be misused that it's usually shorthand from senior developers to say singletons are bad, because understanding what the caveats are about when you should and shouldn't use them are so specific that you're just better off not using them if you're finding yourself in a position where you don't know whether you should or not,
Yeah, the answer's so nuanced, and it really does take either time to explain it, or for the person you're explaining to have some experience with some of the pain points of singletons. And that's one of the reasons why I haven't even touched it in a video yet, and I've wanted to, and I need to because it's such a prevalent thing. It seems in the Unity, like with Unity developers, where the singleton, like it always comes up to this day. Like always see in forum posts or on the subreddits, I always see people asking about singletons, and I don't know. Yeah, it's just one of those things where, if you think about when you would use a singleton, typically it's in a situation where it's like the easiest fix, and you're like, everyone's like, oh wow, it's so easy, I'll just put in a singleton, and that right there is almost suspect to me. Like if it's so easy, that kind of makes me think maybe why is it so easy, and is that okay? I don't know. Just I'm kind of skeptical in that way.
Yeah, and again, I keep boiling it down to whenever you're asking the question, should I use a singleton? Don't think about the code itself. Think about what does that statement mean? This thing in perpetuity will only ever have one of this thing, ever. Then ask yourself, do I need that statement to apply truthfully to the thing I'm writing? It may sound like I'm saying the same thing, but I'm really not. A lot of software architecture, people say, should I use MVC here? Don't say that. Say, MVC allows me to separate the model of my code from the way it's presenting from the thing that controls it. Is that sensible in this case? Is it worth all that architecture to get that separation because I'm likely to change my model or change my presenter or change my controller? So don't think of it as, can I apply this or should I apply this? Ask yourself what it does, what it's for, what the pros and cons of it are, and then do you need those? That seems like the same statement. It really, really isn't.
Yep. You brought up patterns earlier, design patterns, and I saw an interesting question when we were talking about Unity ECS earlier. Well, I wanted to just address it before this chat got too far down the line. Someone was saying, asking about mixing Unity ECS with solid and OOP, and someone said trying to mix ECS and nice solid OOP is a very difficult task to do cleanly.
I'd even say it's oil and water. I just don't think they work well at all.
Yeah, and it's an interesting thing, because the whole pattern itself is possible because of OOP, but then when you start to use it, yeah, you're very locked into it, and so you can use some patterns, like you can encapsulate things and use the humble object pattern maybe in your systems or the command pattern, but yeah, it is very hard. Yeah, just wanted to bring that up before we move down the line.
Yeah, because even at a fundamental level, right? I'm going to keep kind of bringing this up as a phrasing, is that it's always about intentionality with software. I get so many questions about literal lines of code that sort of defeat the point. I mean, obviously, I will happily help people with lines of code, but it's really about learning to think in terms of intentionality. And what is the point of ECS? Well, you sacrifice the architectural layers so that things are more memory efficient, and so things can interact with each other in the more optimally way possible. But that you lose then all of the benefits of declaring your objects as you're declaring your code as a set of objects that interact with each other. So on a principle level, ECS and OOP are fundamentally at odds. Their purpose is different. One is to maximize speed and maximize efficiency between entities. One is to maximize your architecture to support extensibility and change and to add kind of readability. But they're completely different. So while technically you can do some things, as Charles was saying, you can benefit from clean code practices, but you cannot really, in a practical sense, apply object-oriented principles on top of ECS.
Yep. Cool. I saw something funny. Vakaro was saying, "What if I want to run my game twice in one application?" I can think of an example. What if you made an MMO, and in that MMO you had like a sub game, like a little tic-tac-toe, or you could play poker, and then all the players could get together and play their own instances of poker. Yeah, you would want a singleton there.
We need a swear jar for any time someone says MMO.
Absolutely. I'm actually gonna get a swear jar and right here. I'll just put it in every time. Oh, that's funny. I thought I saw someone saying tear up my code, but I didn't see any links.
There's some code posted in the code review channel on the Discord.
Oh, that's smart. You people are smart. I didn't even think about that.
Just as one side note, as I'm scanning
Sure.
through here, one of the to kind of tie up the last bow on the singleton concept, one of the questions is why is stateful static bad? Well, in general, anytime like the two words again, they're kind of at odds, right? Static is the implication that there's one of something, and like running state is fine, as in like there's a singleton state, but it comes back to intentionality again. It's the fact that if you have something that's stateful and static, you are saying there is a single instance of this thing, and it has this state. And just in almost every practical application in software, it's very rarely guaranteed that something is a single concept and it has a single state. So if you are going to use singletons, one of the best use cases for them is if you lean into more of a functional style. So you can have functional singletons, which are effectively tools that have no state, and so it doesn't actually matter how many instances you have. So a good example of this is stuff you're probably using already without thinking about it, is the mathf class, or you're using time. I don't like, because that is stateful, but if you're if you're using stuff like mathf, you are using helper objects where realistically all you're doing is removing duplicate code. It makes sense for these kinds of things to have static functions or to be static instances, because they don't really have, there would be no reason for you to duplicate that class. Even if you could make two instances of the mathf class, literally there'd be no point, because they physically aren't different. They cannot be different. And so, yeah. So
and they're deterministic, well, except for time. So it's like you can test those. I think like time is one of those I'd probably wrap it up, just so I can test certain parts of my code if I needed to test. But yeah, I think that's a good point. People are like, or a lot of developers, you'll read a lot of things saying that static classes are the death of testing, but there are cases like helper classes that it is okay to use statics.
Yeah, and to kind of segue to that, to the most recent comment is with pure functions.
Mm-hmm.
So to go into even further weeds, between, you've got ECS as an architectural idea, object orientation is another, and then you can basically do functional style programming. And there's a kind of a very funny subsection of development these days where people swear that functional is the future. It's just the way programming is, and that all things should be functional.
Yeah, what's up with that?
It drives me insane, because functional programming is great. It's actually really, really cool, and technically it's actually older than object-oriented programming, if you want to go down into the weeds of the origins of languages.
Mm-hmm.
But they're not competing with each other. They are tools that can solve problems. So you can have one of them is a hammer, one of them is a screwdriver, and you use the one that you need when you need it. Whether you're arguing if a language should be a functional language, I don't know, that seems like an archaic way to go, to kind of gate your language to be functional only, when you have a language like C# where you can literally write functional code if you want to. Now there's some arguments about whether it's true functional, but it's as good as functional in terms of any practical sense that you need it to be. As for why you would or wouldn't, it's the same kind of idea, right? You use ECS because it is more memory efficient in terms of marshalling data and being faster. You use object orientation when your objective is to partition your code into easy to use chunks and to stack them into more interesting ways and to swap parts out. You use functional programming when you have challenges that you need to do, where you want to avoid risks of danger between state changes. You want to deal with things like concurrent problems, or you want to deal with like money is a great candidate for functional software. If you're doing banking type software, it doesn't matter that it takes far more cycles and you're duplicating large chunks of memory. And there's a lot of problems. Like functional game development is an insane idea if you understand what functional programming is for and how game development works. You can technically do it, but they're kind of at odds with each other. And so understanding what the point of a framework or system or architecture is will really help you answer these questions. So rather than should I use X when I Y, have a look at what problems that particular thing was designed to solve. So functional programming was built to solve problems with things like concurrency and to make testing easier on things like large algorithms. A very good example is literally maths. You have pure functions where they take in data, and given the same deterministic data, you'll get the same thing out every time. And so because of that, you can compose these to make more complex statements. That is a really good case of having recursion, where you can have the same functions call themselves and guarantee you'll get the same inputs and outputs. So it has its place, but its place isn't every problem, just like object-oriented isn't every problem. So yeah, anybody who says everything should be functional now, I don't think they even understand what functional means, because that's not true in any practical sense.
Yeah. Hey, looks like we got a super chat. Thanks, Alex. Appreciate it. So we got a question from him saying, "Can either of you guys explain the Agile slash Scrum methodology? Does it apply to solo developers?" I see you're ready. I got a thought on this.
No, you go first, man, because I have to phrase my thoughts in my own head, because that's a very complicated question.
Well, yeah. So agile, agile development, or if it gets a bad rap because agile and Scrum have both been heavily corporatized and monetized. So, you'll see Scrum classes and books, and then you'll see corporations. Like, I used to work for my local government in Miami, and they were using it, but it was like the managers had put it in because they heard it was a way for everyone to work faster and save them more money. So we did the Scrum classes, got books, got certified, and all that. On the flip side, if you think of agile development, the Agile Manifesto as it was created, and you can look that up, and I'll link it if turns into a clip or something. I'll link that. It's it's designed in order to help you be more efficient as a developer. So, all right, that's basically agile, and you can look that up. But the Scrum methodology is basically a methodology that you use, like a process that you use when you work, and it really is designed for teams. So it consists of things like having a daily stand-up meeting, and having sprints. And sprints are basically periods of time where you focus your work on a goal. So you can say, like my company, we do the Scrum methodology where I work now. We do 3-week sprints. So at the beginning of a sprint, you decide everything you're going to do in the form of tickets or work items, and you place them. We even use an agile board. So you put them on a board, and you say, okay, on the left side of the board is everything that's left to be done. In the middle is everything that's currently in progress, and on the right is everything we've done, completed, and verified. So basically, every day you start the day off by having a stand-up meeting. You say, what have you done since the last time we spoke? What are your current impediments? And what are you going to do today? So let's say it's the first day of the sprint. I'll say, hey, I'm going to take this item off the to-do, and I'm going to work on it. So then you work on it, you put it in progress, and then you put it to done. And then the next day you'll say, oh, I did this task. The idea is, as a team, you're working through these tasks, and you're getting an idea of what's called your velocity. And and this is probably more part of like the corporatized version, where you have like burn down charts, and you have all these things that analyze how the team works. And then you come to the end of the sprint, you have what's called a sprint retrospective, and the team all gets together and says, hey, what worked out during the sprint? What didn't work? Where did we run into issues? All this to say, for teams, it's a mechanism, it's a tool to help teams work together more efficiently, and to learn and cultivate the process of working more efficiently as a particular team. So if the question is, does it apply to solo developers? I personally work in sprints alone. I have my own personal Scrum board where I say this, and I do it on a week-to-week basis. I say, in this sprint, this week, I will be satisfied if I complete this set of tasks, and I do my best to just lay out a set of tasks that I want to do in the week. And I work to my Scrum board. I use this thing called Kanban Flow. It's a website where you set up, a to-do, in progress, and done. And I work to those solo. But what I don't have the benefit of is being able to bounce off other people in my team with a daily stand-up. I don't need to, obviously, because it's just me. So you can do the Scrum methodology alone, but it's really a practice that's designed for teams, and it's based off of this Agile Manifesto, which was created by a bunch of developers at some conference. I don't even know when, and it was designed to help teams be more efficient. So that's it in a nutshell. What are your thoughts?
Right. So
I've probably bought into the whole thing a little too much, since I work in a corporate environment.
I don't know where to start with this. I basically like. Okay. So let me try to paint a scene here. So first and foremost, Charles outlined what it is and how it works. Right, he 100% nailed on the head. It is incremental development with the goal of directing the project based on what happened the previous sprint. So it's in summary, waterfall was the old method: large chunk of features, build them, release them, move on, and that's simply not practical because in realistic terms, you have a backlog, stuff gets left out, new stuff comes in, priorities shift. If you try to design what you're going to do as like a goal, and this is, you can drill this all the way back just to doing any goal, right? If your goal is to clean a room, every single book on how to practically clean your room efficiently tells you to do it in stations, is to quadrantize your work and do it because your priorities will change. You'll clear out a space. You've now got more space. Maybe I'll switch to doing this thing instead. And because if you do it in small chunks, you can better redirect what you're doing, and it just works out more efficient and it's easier to manage what you're doing. If you do anything in a large chunk, you're going to do it worse than if you did it, incrementally in bite-sized pieces. So agile. Well, so I'll be more specific, right? That was the goal. So as software started to grow, people were aware that we can't let a boss say, I need this piece of software, see you in 2 months. It's just not how it works. So what the idea became, let's work on these small incremental steps where we pick a feature, we do the feature, we make sure the app is deployable at the end of a sprint. That's sort of like the golden point of it all. You should still be able to build it and run it and see your application at the end of 2 weeks, or whatever your sprint is. Could be a month, but as long as it's a general cycle. And the idea is, at the end of it, you look at what you've got, you ask yourself what you want next, and then you move on to the next thing. But here's the fun bit. Here's why I was having so much trouble describing it. Not so tough. That's kind of fine. Like you can sort of get the hand. Like it's a product management idea. The problem is when people say agile/scrum. Mm-hmm. This is a very big area. So a fun fact a lot of people don't realize: Scrum technically came before Agile. Scrum came first.
I didn't even know that.
Yeah, a lot of people don't, because Scrum, actually, the point of Scrum wasn't just the stuff I outlined. The stuff I outlined is sort of, we need to get better at the process of building software. Scrum came out of the idea that the thing a programmer's worst at isn't writing software. It isn't even managing time. They're terrible at managing time, but that's not the worst thing.
I know what you're going to say.
The worst thing is mitigating between a business and a programmer, is understanding requirements and turning that into a product. You will often go off and build something you weren't asked for, or the client will describe software to you that they want, but they don't use the right words because you know what the right words are for your environment, and you build the wrong thing, or you're talking across each other. So it's requirement gathering and understanding the client is the worst thing. The developers suck at it. They're just terrible at it. And probably the bit you were thinking as well is documentation, is talking about what it does and how it interconnects. And so the point
I thought
of
you were going to
Scrum,
say estimating.
Oh well, yeah, no, that's a good point. That does maybe that's even higher technically on the list.
Because that's part of the whole. All right. It was part of like when you deal with a manager and they're like, "Hey, do this," and with the waterfall method, it's like, "Okay, I'm gonna do that," and then you don't do it. Why? Why didn't you do it? Because I don't know how to estimate how long it was gonna take. I estimated it was gonna take 2 weeks, but it just didn't because I suck at developers suck at it. And it's bad to say that they stink at estimating because it's just really hard to estimate. You just don't know all the factors until you get into the code.
I get very stubborn with managers. I just tell them I won't give them an estimate, or if I do, I say I will literally double the estimate I have in my head, because it's always better to deliver deliver faster than you think you would, rather than to take longer.
Under promise, over deliver, instead of over promise, under deliver. Yeah,
that's the one. It's rattling around in my head there. Yeah. Anyway, so my point was, the point of Scrum, when it was originally thought of, was actually to solve that problem. It was to solve the problem of the communication between the developer and the business. It's the fact that the developers are terrible at understanding what the business want. They keep thinking about, I will build the software, I will make it do exactly what the requirements say it should do, and everyone will be happy. And that's never true. But if you instead understand what the business want, you can deliver software that better meets their actual goals. So Scrum was a way of saying, let's manage our team efficiently. Let's figure out what the client wants, build the most business value product into what we're doing, and move on. It was meant to make really, really efficient software. That was the original goal of Scrum. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So without going down to the whole Scrum versus Agile and when the split off happened and when the theories came, it eventually boiled out that some of the elements of Scrum got changed and became Agile insofar as it started to become more about the time management and about the cycles and about working with programmers' time. and the business side of it got left to the wayside a bit because it started to be used agile as a way of managing your time and using boards and that kind of stuff, and that became what it was. The whole dealing with the business portion of it sort of got left a bit to the side. But then, in a way of as developers started to use agile and started to really enjoy it, they wanted to bring it into the office because they saw how much benefit it was giving them for the stuff they were doing. So that's where somebody dusted off Scrum, which has all the business connotations, and said, let's make agile, but for business. And it became a nightmare. It became Scrum. That's the joke version of Scrum. And the problem with that is it starts to become a cottage industry where Scrum becomes this thing where you get Scrum training and you become a Scrum master, and there's Scrum handbooks, and there's playing cards with Scrum written on them that you use for planning poker. And it became a business of itself where companies started selling Scrum as they'd burst into your company and solve all your woes by setting up a Scrum architecture and certifying half your team. And it started to become this thing that was just not what it was intended for. So there's still a bit of a war internally between, is Scrum good? Well, it's often bloat and it's often hard to kind of quantify. And the same thing goes for Agile. The spirit of the two are still there. The point is still good. Break your projects into small pieces. Use some sort of managing boards to take the little tasks you've got, move them into functional stuff you're doing and move on. Have your team have visibility on what you're doing. When you're done, have a retrospective, think about what you did, and work on the next portion. All of the concepts are good, but just don't let it become a religion. Don't think about what all of the components are in terms of this whole rigorous set of things that needs to be done.
It's like you do things just to do them because it's the status quo, and it's like, but is it really providing value? And I've been in situations where it's like, we're just going to do the stand-up today, and everyone's like, well, there's nothing has changed, and I don't have any impediments, and everyone knows that. It's like, we're still going to do it. But why? Just because it's like the religion. It's you have to do it every day the same way.
And it has the same problem as well that TDD does, which anybody who says they are agile or they work in a Scrum, they have a Scrum master and they're doing Scrum. If you took any of the big bad Scrum people like Jim Copley, who sort of is one of the big dogs of this whole direction of how Scrum went, he would shout at you and say, you're doing it wrong. You're completely missing the point of what it is, because it's just the whole point is about being lean. Lean is the buzzword. Scrum was about being lean. Modern Scrum is about building an architecture around the processes which you use to build software. So it's big mess.
One thing I didn't mention when I was describing it, I did mention the aspect of it, part of it is you want your team to become more efficient, and this allows you to have a lower, it tightens the feedback loop so you can constantly address what's not working. But realistically, I think the biggest benefit you get is it allows you to tighten the feedback loop on the value you're providing. So obviously, in a business sense, when you're writing software, you're trying to solve someone's problem, whether it be the customer, or if you're in B2B, you're trying to solve some department's issue, a problem with code. So if you do the waterfall method, someone cooks up some big feature and you spend 3 months on it, probably 6 months because you quoted 3 months, but it actually took 6. Then they get it and it's like, well, it's not really, it's kind of valuable and it does a lot of other stuff that I don't really need, but someone thought it would be great to add this feature and that feature. The whole 80-20 rule, where 20% of the application is actually providing value and the other 80 is not. So when you use the Scrum methodology, and I find this in my personal life going week to week, and then also what you described, Jason, how you clean a room, if you clean one segment, and then the feedback loop is tight. It's like, okay, now I clean this. Okay, now I have space that's open. Oh, maybe I'm going to change gears here. Maybe I'm going to put this stuff over there now, and I didn't think about that before. The same thing is with developing using Scrum. Well, let's use a game as an example. Maybe you've cooked up this, huge MMO, and you're like, I've thought of every feature. I made a design document that outlines every single feature. But for all you know, most of those features might not even be fun. So the best thing you can do is say, well, look, I'm gonna get the player to move around, and in this particular case, my unique concept is that they have to collect these little orbs that temporarily increase their certain skills. All right, so maybe that's my thing. So then you spend a week working on that and you get it done. Now you put it in front of users. You let people play test it. You get feedback on it much more quickly than if you were to say, I'm going to develop this whole MMO and then I'm going to put it into alpha. and then you put it in alpha. First of all, you can't get a player base to play, but let's say you did. People are just like, this isn't really that fun. I'm not really interested in auction features anymore. That's a World of Warcraft thing, and we don't really care about auction. We really like this aspect of your game. It's super fast paced. The auction thing I don't really care about. And you're like, well, I just spent like 6 months trying to figure out how to get the auction to work. So it tightens up the feedback loop so that you can provide more value to, in this case, your players. I keep talking about everything in like a business standpoint because that's what I do every day. But yeah, you're game developers. So you really want to be able to say, hey, look, I'm going to go to a local meetup next week, and I want to be able to show a new feature of my game. You don't want to say, oh, I have to wait until the end of the year to show people this. No, you want to get it in front of people as fast as possible. And if you use the Scrum methodology, it helps you, it reins you in. So you're like, okay, this week I'm working on this feature so that I can show it off to someone next week. And then you get that feedback. So you're not like kind of all over the place working on this and that and the other. It's you focus on one thing. And then in that way you can provide the most value, the most fun experience for your players. So that's that.
And as for tools, it doesn't really matter. Like I noticed a few things in chat. People are saying hack and slash. Yeah, I've used that. Used Jira, Asana, Kanban. There's an actual Kanban app thing, a board version. Trello. It doesn't matter. Like every single one of them boils down to it is a board, usually split into 3 columns, sometimes more, and it effectively boils down to have your backlog of things you want to do, pick the ones you're doing, finish them. When you're done, evaluate, do it again. There's a lot more to it, and there's a lot of other benefits, especially if you start talking about how you manage. Like my favorite concept in Scrum is what's called T-shirt sizes or points, depending on who your Scrum master is.
Yeah.
It basically boils into that concept I briefly touched on earlier called planning poker. I don't think we should go into it. I think it's a whole different area that's irrelevant to what we're talking about here. But suffice it to say, there's a lot of benefits of that stuff that can help you with your own stuff, but also there is a lot more to it when it starts coming to business scale that gets very beneficial. But in short, any endeavor you want to do, you could use something like Trello to manage it. And I've done this myself with just my wall. So you literally just put 3 notes on the wall that say to do, doing, and done.
Yeah. My wife and I do Scrum, so we have our own little board up there.
And it's amazing. Like you have no idea the sense of satisfaction you get when you have, clean office and you move a sticker from one side over to the other, and then you pick the next thing and say, what did I say? Oh, I'm going to go and organize my books, and you then go and do that and you move it over, and you can actually start to see as things move over from the left side to the right. In my case, you can actually see progress. You physically see the amount of stuff you've done grow relative to the amount of stuff left to do. It's a very good technique for any kind of project management, and it just happens to be the one that tends to fall on most commonly for big projects.
Yeah. And it's one of those things too where you just got to know the rules to break the rules. You don't want to have to do every aspect of it, like we just said, the daily stand up. It's not necessarily valuable to do it every day, especially if you have a small team and everyone can quickly say, no, we're good. We don't. Someone might say, hey, can we do the stand up today? Because I ran into an impediment and I need to talk about it. So that's valuable. But yeah, you don't want to get stuck like doing every aspect of it, and then just making it something that's more of a burden to you. So yeah. See what we got in the chat here. Charles, your cat is literally in the same position I get into on the floor after all my unit tests fail after a single line change. If all of your unit tests are failing after one single line change, then you are not writing, what do you call it? Small enough tests. It should only fail for one thing.
Yeah, there's that rule, your tests shouldn't rely on each other. And if that's the case, you have too many collaborators or your collaborators aren't split up correctly. So if you have multiple tests failing, pull out the old mocks or substitutes and start mocking a lot more of those features.
An interesting way that I read about it described is your tests should all be able to run in parallel. And I thought that was an interesting way to look at it, that you should be able to run every single one of your tests at the exact same time, and they shouldn't affect each other. It's just like a fancy way of saying, yeah, they should be completely decoupled from each other. So, and the worst part, that one line was a comment.
Yeah.
You should never use comments. Self-documenting code. The only comments I ever write are to-dos or when I have some like regular expression that who's going to understand a regular expression. So I'll drop a comment on here that says, this just checks if this is a phone number.
Or the occasional "Here be dragons, don't touch this code. It does something and it works. Leave it alone."
When I was in college and I was like kind of more idealistic and I don't know, I'm passionate about writing code, but whatever. I was super idealistic and young and passionate. I would put little like, so I cringe to think about it, like little animal pictures in like ASCII, like a little whale. Oh man, I'm gonna burn those repositories to the ground.
I literally, when I built my first personal website, I did it. Well, not my first. I definitely built. Without dating myself too much, I built a DHTML Buffy the Vampire Slayer fan site when I was a lot younger. Yeah. So let's skip over that one. When I built my first corporate one for myself as an entity for doing contract work, just to show off, I did it in Node.js, and I built a preprocessor and a loader, and I had it that every time the page generated itself, it would write a different ASCII meme into the console for every page load. It was dumb, really dumb. But yeah, it's sometimes fun to play with that stuff.
Yeah, it's funny too that a lot of people don't really realize that. Well, I can't really speak about a lot of industries, but the industry I work in right now is compliance and security. So I'm not allowed to put anything in the code that like that. Like it would go against contracts, So it's like that's so boring. But hey, if you're writing your own game, go ahead. Put ASCII comments if you want. Would you agree with this sentiment that the only times you should put comments are for to-dos, obscure code like regular expression, and like you said, comments that just say "Don't touch this"? Is there any other reason you'd want to put comments in code? Maybe tutorials, obviously. If you're like, if I'm giving out code on my Patreon,
Oh, sure, if you're explaining stuff. But even then, I personally find that I would prefer to have running examples that I could have in comparison without the actual comments, if I could get away with it. In fact, I'd even push back on to-dos. To-dos are something that should be in your backlog, not in your code.
That's fair. That's fair.
Now, I sometimes use it as a bookmark. At least I used to before I realized both Writer and Visual Studio have a bookmark tool. So you can actually you can even get other plugins for it. So even to-dos shouldn't really be used because they're all it does is tell you that code should go here and nothing else. Though an interesting point on the whole comment thing is something Bob Martin said once I thought was really interesting. I never thought about it this way, but if you ever come across commented out code, don't even read it. And it's like, what? Don't read it. And your first thought as a programmer is you panic and go, but it could do something important. And if I have to do some code there, if I have to add a feature, I need to know what it does.
That mentality is the problem.
Yeah. And then especially because you're thinking, well, I'll just comment it out someday and it might do what I need it to do, or it might have something. And then you realize this code could have been written months ago. In fact, you can probably even check. It won't even work anymore. There's a very good chance a lot of the entities and assets and declarations are wrong. And now you're going to uncomment it and start debugging commented out previous code that somebody wrote that you don't even know what it does. Yeah. So providing you're using source control, which you should always use source control, never not use source control. If you ever see commented out code, even code you wrote yourself, it's meant to indicate what your goal was to do here, but that doesn't matter because clearly you either didn't do it or you moved on to something else. When you come back to reevaluate the problem, all your old code is going to do is lock you into the previous mindset of what you previously thought you might have possibly needed to do. So delete it and ask yourself, what am I actually doing? Let's write the code here. And that's still very hard for me. I still stop every time when I go, I'll just skim it once just in case there's something important. And like I can't bring myself to immediately delete it, but as a mindset, it's a very good one. I think it's something to keep in mind. The point of a comment should be to elucidate, not to confuse you further. And if you have comments in your code, it's usually because you didn't describe it well enough in what you were doing, or the code has gotten so complicated it literally needs someone to write a book beside it to explain what it does. And that's insane if you think about what that really means, you know?
That code you described, that's called zombie code. Zombie
Yeah.
code. It's like it's dead. Oh no, my camera's gonna die, so we might have to wrap this stream up soon.
Zombie camera to go with it.
Yeah, right. Let's see. Yeah, let's finish this up. We didn't get to the code review, but I saw that we had some submissions on the code review channel, so we'll plan next week. I think we'll do an earlier stream in the week, maybe Wednesday. It's a holiday, Thanksgiving, so in the U.S. So we'll probably do Wednesday. We'll review that code then. And if you guys want to drop code in the review channel on our Discord code review channel, go ahead and do that. What was I gonna say? Oh, yeah. When I was looking up that zombie code, I was looking for the definition on Google. I found a meme. It's the most interesting man in the world, and it says, "I don't always test my code, but when I do it in production." It's awesome, man. It hits so close to home.
And I kind of wish that, yeah, exactly. I wish I didn't have stories of that happening in my head. Or, the times you change the database that's hitting the live data that the users are using. So it's always a bit risky.
My heart rate just went up, man.
Yeah. Like people think, oh no, you never publish on Friday to production because you might break it. Oh yeah? Well, us real developers who live on the edge are messing with the entity using the database while it's still live in real time while the other clients are using it. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think this was a great stream. We did it an hour and 11 minutes. I want to keep them around like an hour and a half, maybe to 2. But it's downstairs in my delivery room. I ordered a battery camera. Or what am I saying? A battery for my camera that you can plug in, so that I won't have this issue next time. But yeah, great stream. Thank you guys for coming out. Thank you for all the super chats. Please join us on Discord. We have an awesome community. People like Jason who like to rant about MMOs and other things and singletons. That's always going on.
Is that my new legacy now? I'm just the guy who hates MMOs now, apparently.
You know what's funny? I'm trying to design some, spoiler alert, some merch because I want to drop some merch next year. Oh yeah, my battery just died, so sorry, you're not gonna be able to see me. And I was thinking of like, there's got to be a shirt idea there about like ranting on MMOs. So if you all have any ideas, feel free to share them. Could you tell me what asset I should... Oh, I thought he was asking about the stream. Save your questions for next week. We will be back. I'm going to try to post the time earlier so that way you guys can bookmark it. I've been doing it the day of, but I think probably by Sunday I'll have a better idea of when we're going to stream. And yeah, it's over. Sorry. My camera died. But yeah, thanks for coming out. Oh, wait, it came back on. Oh, no, I think it's just having its death throes. My camera's like, yeah, change the battery. You got any parting words there, Jason?
Not really. There was one last question, which I thought was a real quick answer. Someone asked how you should test a chain of responsibility pattern. I mean, by definition, it's a chain of responsibilities, right? Each single link of the chain is a single responsibility. That's literally your clue right there. Test a responsibility for a single chain link. If they all individually work, then they should all work together.
Love it. Great way to end. All right, everyone, go to Discord and continue the discussion. Talk to you guys later.
Good luck.